Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a TSA News conversation with British artist and TSA member Stephanie Smart. I'm Kat Duguid, and I'm excited to speak to Stephanie about her creative process. Her work blends paper techniques of all sorts, including quilling and folding and bookbinding techniques, with embroidery. Constraining herself to paper and thread, Stephanie creates beautifully intricate paper garment sculptures that incorporate fashion history while illustrating the personal stories of the people that inspire each piece. Stephanie's sculptures are a culmination of extensive research of personal stories and details of fashion history. She documents her research and process on her website and blog, and I highly encourage viewers to read more there as the conversation just touches the surface. So, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you very much.
So, Stephanie, I've got your slides that you sent me earlier, and thank you so much for sending those so I could prepare some questions and we can discuss both some of your early work leading up to this collection, and then your residency and culminating exhibition on display at Firle House.
I went to Istanbul, not work related, but in top, I can never say it, Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. I saw this paper kaftan that you can see on the screen, and it had been made for a sultan, and he was supposed to have actually, I don't think he had actually worn it, but it had been made to be worn, I believe, under his armor into battle. And it was covered in Quranic script and geometry, and I thought it was so a beautiful thing in itself, but also just such a fascinating idea that someone's spirituality and their faith could be written on the surface of a garment they might wear, something ephemeral like religion, on a physical object, and then on the outside of your body rather than on the inside of you, visible for other people to see. And I just got interested in that idea, really, that sort of things that are within us, memories, thoughts, feelings, and faith, might be shown to other people visibly on the surface of us rather than hidden away on the inside. I also was quite intrigued by the idea of obviously wearing a paper item and the sort of vulnerability of the paper, but also of the body inside. It reminded me, the shape of the paper kaftan reminded me of a sort of hospital gown, and the idea that when you wear that, your body is quite vulnerable, but also the garment is vulnerable too. So I started experimenting at that stage. I think on the next slide you can see my first early experiment by making my own paper kaftan, and the idea of playing with knickers as well was sort of this idea of vulnerability. And then again on the next one you can see I did a year as artist in residence at the Muse Gallery in Portobello Road in London, and that was where I had the chance to really start developing this whole idea. At that point I was just working flat, so all the pieces were although they were kind of three-dimensional, they were laid flat and shown flat like the paper kaftan had been in Istanbul. And yeah, it wasn't until my next exhibition after that that I went into 3 dimensions, and that was at Danny House in Sussex, and that's an Elizabethan mansion, beautiful building. And I had the chance to be artist in residence there between 2016 and 17, and started talking to the owner and looking into the background of the house and the residence over time, but also talking to the current residents, because actually now part of it is converted into a retirement apartments, and some of the residents are in their 80s, 90s, 100s, and so have fascinating life stories and war stories. And I was able to spend a year getting to know some of them quite well, and talking to them from about clothes, so maybe about the uniform that they wore during the war, or some other item of clothing that was important to them, and then sort of digging into their life stories through coming at it from clothes and going on from there, really. And it was wonderful. So that you can see there the sketchbook that I kept during that year, sort of thinking about how to then turn these into pieces. And I wanted to reflect the whole history of the house, so I wanted to go back to Elizabethan times, and sort of come forward. So that's an English court dress. I was, impressed in the V&A by the width of some of these dresses, and I wanted to do one myself. So I've put the Danny house right at the front and center of that dress, actually made a cardboard model of it. And then it's also in the drawings on the two sides of the skirt. You've got peonies embroidered at the bottom in sort of big urns, because they were standing on the outside area at Danny. And then you've got embroidery at the top on the flowers. But the pieces inspired in particular by one of the residents, Joanna Bastin, and her family had actually owned this house when it was still owned just by one family. Those images show the back of the dress and a little bit of embroidery. There's the picture of these are pictures from Joanna Bastin's family album when her family owned Danny House, before it then went into public ownership, and now it's gone back into private ownership. So yes, when she was a child, she was there, and I've embroidered and drawn her onto the back of the dress.
And when you first took this residency, had you already thought about, like, was it the intention to move into three-dimensional, or was that move into three-dimensional more of a reflection of your conversations?
No, I very much wanted to go three-dimensional, and I think my works, well, it's just changed and got so much better and more interesting since doing that. So yeah, that was a purposeful move, and yeah, working with a mannequin is more interesting.
It's really fascinating to see, and I love the layering that you're doing, both in the storytelling and the physical sculpture of the object.
Well, so Joanna's background, I found it fascinating that she's ended up retired and living in the house that her family owned when she was a child, but they haven't owned in between times and don't own now. It's a curious kind of full circle. She's lived all over the world. She's done, all sorts of interesting things, had a family, and then she's ended up back in this beautiful environment, but with other people there as well. So I wanted to incorporate some of her story, and she actually comes into one of the other pieces a little bit as well. Yeah, I wanted to reflect, even the shape of the building is, I hope, reflected in the shape of the skirt. And the embroidery and the sleeves, those were allowing me to just sort of explore actual pieces from that time as well. So I went to the V&A Cloth Workers Centre and looked at pieces in storage from the time. So it's every piece is a melding. It's about it. Usually, sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's about one particular real individual, either living or dead. But it's also about pieces garments that I've seen that were once worn, or it's about the building, or it's about all of those things really coming in, social history, and yeah, I just draw threads, if you like, from all sorts of different directions, and we end up with a design somehow. It was just, I mean, one of my first impressions of Danny House was driving up. The driveway goes on for miles. It's an English country house. It's got this, you go through the beautiful land that surrounds it, and you go slowly because there are sheep wandering across the driveway. And as I drove up to the house one time, a green woodpecker sort of swooped, sort of beside my car, and it just said something to me of Englishness and this country house estate, and it was just meaningful to me at the time. So I wanted to then, this one is, I suppose, more about experimenting with paper and embroidery. It's kind of, the bird is probably one of the most heavily embroidered areas of a dress that I've done. Normally it's smaller bits of embroidery at a time. And the skirt was actually made of just layers and layers of paper, and bits of paper, sort of bits of leftover paper at times, and I've just embroidered and embroidered, almost so that the paper in places fell apart and sort of shredded, and the thread was becoming the textile in itself. And again, that you can see in that picture, actually, that's from Joanna Bastin, the same lady as before. It's from her mother's photo album. And she was, again, telling me a bit about her family through clothes, through things that they'd worn. And she dug out this picture, and it was of her mother as a bridesmaid when she was younger. And we were kind of joking that we didn't think the bridesmaids had realized quite how see-through their skirts were in this picture that ended up in the newspaper. But I love the idea that the skirts almost look hooped. So I'd been experimenting with sort of how I would construct the understructures of these garments. I mean, particularly for the last piece you saw, I had to make a cardboard framework. I'm very much, I'm not going to ever use anything that isn't paper and thread or cardboard. So I'm not going to use metal hoops or anything. Everything has got to be made out of paper or card. So I had to work out, how to make this wide structure for that last one. And for this one, I wanted to play with the idea of a hooped skirt and a hooped understructure. So I've literally cut out of large pieces of card circles, and then they are strung together with misahiki, the Japanese rice paper cord, and they sort of hang like a hooped understructure, and the dress sort of is partially revealing that because of that photo and the partial revealment of their legs. You know, I just use whatever I need to interpret my idea, and I kind of look for ways to do that each time. So each piece is a huge learning curve. I don't know how to do it until I do it, if you see what I mean. So yeah, it's interesting each time.
Can you talk a little bit more about the constraints that you've given yourself with using the paper with the thread with these pieces?
Yeah, I mean, if you mean in terms of compared to textiles, then I don't really know, because I'm not a textile artist, so I haven't worked with material first. So I don't know if that's good or bad. I mean, it might be sort of freeing me up because I'm not constrained to any techniques that I've learned about fashion or pattern cutting or anything. I've never made a garment to wear by myself out of material. My aunt used to make clothes, and she helped me make a couple of dresses when I was at school, but that's it. I don't know how to sort of read patterns or anything. So I kind of feel that probably frees me up in some ways. Otherwise, paper for me, because I'm coming at this more as a fine artist. I mean, actually, I was trained as a decorative artist, so my degree is decorative arts, and my MA is in cosmology and philosophy. So I was, I went off at a bit of a tangent at that point. But I was interested in, how people had thought about the world and how we all related to the world, and even my MA then has come back into kind of what I'm doing, in the sense that what I said about the Islamic kaftan, showing our insides on our outsides, the psyche and how we relate to the world. And how the world relates to us. So these sort of philosophical ideas are, around in my head. And decorative arts was wood, metal, ceramics, textiles, and glass, but I don't remember actually doing the textile element. I'm not quite sure how I missed that. But I specialised in glass then for quite a number of years afterwards. And although that sounds like a complete departure to this as well, I'm still interested in the idea of translucency. I mean, even that skirt is probably a good example, you know, the idea of seeing through your material, but also seeing through the history and the person, and back to these ephemeral kind of notions. So my work and my career has gone, you know, at various different angles, but for me, it all kind of makes a cohesive whole. And I feel very much like I'm making fashion as a sculpture, as a sculptor, rather than as a dressmaker. And paper's actually freeing for me in the sense that I'm used to drawing, and because giving myself a surface that I can draw on, both with the sewing machine, free machine embroidery, but also with pencil, and you know, I can literally just draw onto the surface if I want to. It makes more sense to how I've worked in the past, really. Yeah, this was inspired, obviously, as it shows there, from a 1950s full kind of the full skirts that you might have worn to dance in, but primarily it was inspired by Kenneth Parson. And if you go on to the next slide, you can actually see an image of him standing beside the dress. And really sadly, he's died since then, but he was in his mid-90s at that stage. And he'd been a paratrooper and had been dropped over Normandy on his 21st birthday, and he still had his jacket. And so although he was struggling a little with dementia at the time, I was so, you know, honored to have this conversation with him and sit down and ask him about his experiences, and his memory was good and his recall was good, and he actually put the jacket on for me and sort of modeled it, and just the whole idea of falling out of a plane into enemy territory, you know, not knowing what you're going to find, and then having to dig a hole to sleep in at night, and you know, some of the things he was describing, it was too important not to want to, you know, base one of my pieces around his story specifically. So obviously the skirt design also reflects the shape of a parachute, and there are little lights embedded in the base to sort of reflect the idea of falling into a starry sky. And I enjoyed working with tissue paper for the first time on the wings. I wasn't sure how well it would hold up to going through a sewing machine, but even tissue paper can be put through a sewing machine if you're careful. So yes, it's quite a, you know, that dress means quite a lot to me just because of him, you know, absolutely because of him. Yeah, actually, in some ways, this piece does relate to the Regency collection, as it will be shown at Firle, because I'm actually going to put this piece in as well, although it's from a past collection, just in order partly to illustrate the difference in the design of skirts from the Regency to the Victorian era, how, you know, they had all slimmed right down to the Empire kind of line, and then they widened back up again, which I find really kind of slightly bemusing that women are, you know, got that sort of freedom and weren't corseted in quite as much, or, you know, restrained in quite the same way, and then they went back to it, which, you know, I'd love to wear dresses like this, but even so, I was surprised that change kind of happened in reverse in some. So yes, this piece, as you say, from the front at least, it's almost just a design of a Victorian, you know, inspired dress, but at the back, actually, on the train, there are images, again, taken from my research of the house. Those pictures just show some of the construction of it, and there again, I've made the understructure out of cardboard, so that's the bustle that I made out of cardboard. But on the next image, I think you can see I've written out a quote. It was from a magazine from a resident, one of the family members, for, I think it was Country Life, something like that, some sort of magazine like that at the time. And I just thought it was a beautiful quote about the idea of who had lived in this house over time. And it's written down the front, and then there are images either drawn or embroidered of past residents that I took from the paintings in the Great Hall. And then right at the bottom is, again, a picture of the house. And then I've drawn, you can't actually see in that photo, but I've drawn the current residents as well beneath that. So that was just everybody together on the back of the dress, really. But this is going to be shown front on at the Firle Place in their Victorian anteroom. They have a room where the wallpaper and everything is from that period, so we're going to tie that in and, yeah, illustrate the changes of fashion too.
I love how you've worked in the history of the house and its inhabitants on the train. I wish I could see it in person, Stephanie, so I could see the details, especially when you're talking about going back and forth between, the hand drawing and then machine stitching or drawing with stitch. I think would be just a really beautiful thing to see.
The roses down the front are cut sort of circles that, I put one on top of another and then sort of made the rose shapes from. There's embroidered forms, what else to call them, around the waistband, and they match down the sleeve, and then there's tissue paper is on the sleeve is under the embroidery to give it that kind of slightly sheer look. And again, for the sort of cuffs, are they cuffs if they're only halfway down your arm? Anyway, the bottom frill. So yeah, it's a mixture of folded paper, cut paper, and free machine embroidery. I think discovering that you could take the foot off your sewing machine and just go wild was, it was just the thing that has made all the difference to my working practice, really. For that, I believed you had to sew in straight lines, and as soon as I found out you could draw with the sewing machine, it was like, okay, this gives me a complete new, possibilities came out of that. So that was exciting at that point. But I was trying to look at different centuries, different decades, have a spread of time, really, from Elizabethan to now in the pieces. And the Great Hall that I showed him, which was what we saw on the very first image of the slideshow, it's got this beautiful polished sort of floor, and the idea that people would have crossed it time and again, across all these centuries. I needed some sort of footwear that reflected the fact that people have moved through this house, and it's a beautiful ornate house, so the footwear had to be kind of ornate, but also I was working with actually this piece and the next one that you see were both inspired by one particular gentleman who was a Canadian poet, and again in his 90s, but we were looking at some of his work. Those are just sort of some background shots of how it comes together. And that's his poem, "Crowds thronging past me as I stand still to save a fleeting contentment." And it's a haiku, obviously, and it seemed to sum up the fact that we were in this beautiful environment in a huge estate, and sort of cut off in some ways from the buzz and the speed of the modern world, and so we were sort of peaceful and standing still, and yet the world is so busy, and at the same time reflect the fact that people have run through this house, they have walked through this house, they have stampeded in that sense by over time, lots of them going through it. Yeah, it was again a amalgamation of ideas, and getting to know Morgan was lovely. So he, as I say, he is reflected in the next piece as well. So "The Age is a Man" is another a poem, and it's written. I got him to write it in his tiny script down the front of the jacket. In each of those white areas down the front, there is a single line of the poem, and it's also inspired, obviously, by Shakespeare's "The Seven Ages of Man." And it's about, his poem is about the point in his life when he realised he was old. And it just kind of shocked him that was it. He'd moved into the last phase of his life. So I wanted to reflect that. But if you go on to the next slide, you'll see also his partner, Oz. She was reflected in the waistcoat underneath the jacket, because she showed me she'd been a diplomat's wife. I think she'd been married about 3 times. She was in her 90s at that stage, and she's reached 100 since then. And she showed me this beautiful jacket, a pink jacket that she'd worn as a diplomat's wife, and you can see her as her younger self in that black and white image. But also, you know, she talked about her war experiences, which were, you know, quite incredible. I mean, she didn't have to sign up as a Canadian, but she did, and was she was number 8 in that women's corps, and she came over on the on this, I can't remember the name of the ship, Queen Elizabeth, I think, and that's the embroidered ship there on the front of the waistcoat, and down below is the symbol of her unit. And then there's a embroidered gold caterpillar that you can almost half see there, because her husband had been awarded this, at the time, had been awarded this gold caterpillar, which again was something about if you survived jumping out of a plane during the war, you were given a gold caterpillar. I can't remember that. I can't remember the whole story, but you had to have survived, basically. And so obviously, you know, many people didn't get it. So yeah, it was lovely to combine the two of them. Now they only had become partners sort of 8 years previous, you know, in their older age, but to combine them by having a frock coat over a waistcoat like that, those two pieces. So yeah.
And your Talking Wardrobes website, or excuse me, Talking Wardrobe website, would you like to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, that's come out of the Danny experience, really. It was so lovely to talk to people about their lives generally, but to come at it from the idea of something they wore once upon a time and the memories attached to when they wore that. I the only other thing that was particularly inspired this was that I have a memory myself of when I moved into a flat in Brighton, and there was no wardrobe, and I didn't know what to do with my clothes, so I actually put picture hooks all the way around the wall, and I just hung all my best things on hangers on these picture hooks, and sometimes lying in bed it just felt like I was kind of at the center of a party, but all the guests were me, if you like, and kind of that had an effect too. And as I looked at the things I'd worn at different times, you know, I had specific memories of clothes, so they were kind of linked to different events in my life, and I like that idea, and I like the idea of talking to other people about maybe something specific that they had worn at a specific event, and the memories, and then drawing out their life story from that. So I'm looking to keep on collecting stories, and I want people to, you know, let me know if they've got a story, if something related to a garment, if they could show me a photo of the garment or a photo of themselves wearing that garment. I just really like to collect stories over time, and then, you know, make pieces inspired by them, possibly at some point in the future. Yeah, resource for myself.
And the hidden wardrobe, the next slide you've got.
Yeah, that's just the title that I've given to the research I've done, both during the Danny one. I started the Danny project. I started it, as I said, going to the B&A cloth workers and things, and actually seeing pieces in storage. I hadn't known years back that you could do that, and it's just grown through the Regency project. I've worked, you know, I've done a lot of research into the period and into the fashion of the time. And I've been to quite a few buildings, institutions. I think they're shown on the next slide, are they?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so Chertsey Museum, Worthing Museum, the V&A, the Fan Museum in Greenwich. Killerton House is where the National Trust fashion collection is based, or some of it. That was one of the first places I went to see some real Regency garments in storage. And the National Maritime, I was shown some uniforms, and they informed 2 of the pieces that I made, and Bath Fashion Museum as well. So the hidden wardrobe is the title I've given to where on my website I've recorded the images and that I've seen and the research that I've done. And then the other 3 buildings shown there, obviously Firle Place, where the exhibition of the Regency Wardrobe will be in the autumn. Regency Townhouse is where I was artist in residence for the first 15 months of the project, working, very lucky to be able to talk to the curator there. He's got a lot of knowledge about the period, but also working with a team of volunteers who are based there, and the building is sort of run by volunteers, and they've carried on working with me since. They've actually helped me not only to research the period, but also to actually make some of the elements of the dresses, the pieces. And the Royal Pavilion has given me access to go in and take photographs, which you're not normally allowed to do, of the wallpapers and decorative elements like that. So some of those have found their way onto the garments, as well as we'll see as we go on. So yeah, working with lots of different places. Yeah.
Did you have Firle Place in mind, or did that come out of the residency?
No, COVID has changed everything. Originally, we were due to exhibit in May last year, just when everything closed, the world closed down. So things have taken various turns since then. Firle is such an amazing find and such an amazing fit, because they had, as you said earlier, this Firle Place was Hartfield, Emma's home in the latest filming of Emma. And so they had Regency, in their minds, and it just came together really well. But that was during the first lockdown that my conversations with them kind of developed. And because I then had a year since then to keep working on the project than I was expecting to, the project has grown. Some new pieces have come out of that, or I've had to do things in different ways to the ways I was expecting. So one piece specifically is now inspired by Firle, but it's actually a jewelry box. So, and I haven't got any images of it here, but it is my first piece of furniture, if you like. So again, made out of paper and card. Yeah, my first piece of furniture.
Do you talk about your pieces as gowns, or do you talk about them as a sculpture?
That's an interesting question. I'd have to listen to myself and see what I do, because I'm not sure really. I think I sometimes call them dresses, sometimes garments, sometimes pieces. I think I go right the way across the spread. How I'm feeling at the time and the context probably. But yes, the paper cut silhouette was such a popular, piece of art to make at the time, and some artists like Augustin Edouard became quite renowned, and it's actually an art form that has been kind of described since as kind of democratizing portraiture, because obviously up until then it tended to be the wealthy that could have their portrait painted and then have them hanging on their walls in their big homes, and this silhouette cutting allowed for everybody more. So I think it was done on the pier at Brighton and what have you, so anybody could get their silhouette cut, and I thought that was a lovely idea. Although I'm working in these amazing historical spaces that were owned by the wealthy at the time, I was interested in all the classes, and I wanted to reflect the idea of this black outline, sort of having all your features taken away, but then sometimes put back again. So like that one you can see with the beautiful white lace that's been painted back onto her. So although they were sometimes just black forms, sometimes they would embellish them with gold or white or cream painting or drawing. And sometimes they were placed onto backgrounds. So the one in the middle shows a drawn background to give the silhouette context. So all of those ideas came into the next series of dresses we will see, and also these beautiful wallpapers, which are just so stunning at the pavilion. So these are sort of background pictures of these pieces under construction, showing the different elements as they were coming together. And there's a picture in the top line at the middle, you can see where I've sewn tissue paper onto this black paper tablecloth, and then I'm cutting away around the stitching just to leave the design using the color of the tissue paper, and otherwise I'm tracing. One of the wallpapers has been made into wrapping paper, so I actually had luckily a large piece of it, and could trace and then use white transfer onto the front of one of the other skirts, and that's quilling down the bottom right hand corner, the little details on one of the sleeves. But if you go on to the next one, then you can see the first two of the dresses, and the hangings behind I've made as wall hangings, because again, playing with that idea that silhouettes might have been put onto backgrounds to give them context, and I wanted something behind my dresses. So I've made, they are wall hangings, but they will be displayed kind of freestanding on easels, hanging behind the dresses. That one on the left, my left, is a sort of phoenix come flying dragon. He's from the wallpaper at the top of the banqueting hall where the Prince Regent, obviously beneath, would have sat and had his big soirees. And he's embroidered, that's all gold embroidery onto, again, this black paper tablecloth. I want to say fabric. It really does feel like fabric, actually. That's such a useful material for me, that tablecloth, paper tablecloth material. You see, I fall over these terms myself, material, but it's not material. But it's really lovely to sew on, and it almost feels a bit like cheating because it is so much like fabric, but I can sew other papers onto it. Yeah, so that's two of them, and then the next two I think are on the next slide. Next three of them. So I did two as a pair, sort of almost matching pair, because of two dresses I'd seen at Bath Fashion Museum that had been made for two sisters to attend a ball that happened in Brussels on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo, when all the men apparently had to, battle was announced during the ball, and they all had to leave in their dinner suits and literally go off and start fighting. But these sisters had these dresses made in rather strange colours. I felt they were kind of browns and yellows, so I changed the colours, but they had stripes. They had long stripes on these dresses, so those have appeared on the sleeves, and the fishes down the bottom and the lotus kind of shape on the skirts, those again are from the King's apartments at the Brighton Pavilion, and the other dress shows the wallpaper from the music room at the Pavilion, inspired by kind of Eastern imagery. Yeah.
When you're creating the garments or sculptural pieces, do you come up with characters for each one? Like, is there a backstory in your mind of who this person is, or where they're wearing this garment?
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect question for these pieces. So not only was I trying to turn paper cut silhouettes and art form from the time into 3 dimensions, and therefore give the art form, I was also trying to give form, if you like, to specific women. And I worked with one of the researchers from the Regency Townhouse, who, well, she was amazing, because I kind of said, I'd like 5 women to base each of these pieces around, or to imagine that they might have worn them to a gathering. But therefore I'd need to know that these women knew each other, because I want to make this gathering something that might actually have happened in real life. So they might all have come together for a coffee morning sort of thing, in Regency parlance, which that isn't. And so, because the Regency Townhouse is based in Brunswick Square in Brighton, and they've got a lot of research of who's lived in the square because of that, then she started researching that particular area and trying to find me 5 women. And I said, I'd like a bit of a spread of ages, and I'd also like 2 sisters, please, because I'd seen this pair of dresses at the Bath Fashion Museum, and I wanted to relate 2 of the dresses to real sisters. And she did it. I mean, she came back and she said, I found you Lady Grace Gore, and her daughter was also called Grace Gore. So we had a mother and a daughter, so different ages. We had Maria, who lived in number 10 in Brunswick Square, and Lady Grace and her daughter had also lived in Brunswick Square. And then she found me 2 sisters, Albania and her sister, and another lady as well. And I ended up with 5 women who had lived close together. And then not only that they might have known each other just from living in close, connection with each other. But she managed to find the guest list for a ball that happened at the Brighton Pavilion in 1831. And on it, it was a ball that was being held in honour of the Duke of Sussex, the last Duke before Harry. So that was the only other time that title's been used. And it was to celebrate his birthday. And on this guest list were these 5 women. So we knew that they knew each other because they would have mixed in the same, higher echelon of sort of social circles. And then when I started working with Firle as well, it turned out that Lord and Lady Gage and the Gage family, the Firle Place is their family seat. It turned out that they had been on this guest list as well. So they would all have known each other, these 5 women and Lord and Lady Gage, and they would have mixed with royalty. And they all went to this event in 1831 that was featured in the Brighton Gazette afterwards, with the full guest list. And it was just an amazing piece of research. I was just so, blown over by the fact that she could do this for me. I just kept throwing, I'd like this, and I'd like, I wanted like that, and she just did it. Her name was Jill Vegas, and she's amazing.
Did you marry the motifs from the wallpaper inspiration to specific narratives from their stories?
It was Albania and Isabel, and the 2 sisters. Anyway, not to their stories, but to the fact that this ball was at the Brighton Pavilion, which is why it's the wallpapers of the Brighton Pavilion that are decorating the dresses, because it's reflecting the fact that they went to this event and they would all have been together in the Brighton Pavilion. So it was, tying in those elements. The stripes on the sleeves of the pair of sisters' dresses were related to these other sisters who went to this ball at the Battle of on the eve of the Battle of Waterloo. So again, there were just lots of different threads coming in of ideas and layers of history, sort of playing in. But I loved the fact that I had 5 real women to relate to as I was making the pieces. Yeah, that was really special. It's quite an impressive portrait that she's standing in front of. The theme of the ball, I mean, it's what everyone thinks about with Regency, don't we? And we watch adaptations on television from the period or about the period, and they're always going to balls, and it seems to have been the sort of societal, sort of core really, were these events that people went to. So I knew there had to be a ball gown at the centre of the collection, and also early on, one of the first things I spoke to the curator at the Regency Townhouse about was the idea that for a ball in any house they were, how they had balls in smaller houses as well as these great country estates, but they would roll up the carpets, effectively roll up these big rugs that they would have on the floors, and they might chalk on the floor, and that was partly to stop dancers slipping. So in sort of smaller balls, lower down the social scale, you might just chalk out lines or shapes that people would be dancing over. But if you were important and you had someone really important coming to the ball that you wanted to impress, you might hire an artist and get them to come in the day before and chalk out a beautiful design all over the floor. And then when your guests arrived for the ball, they would all stand and admire it and oohs and ahs, and then they would dance all over it all evening, destroy it. So it would be an ephemeral piece of art that only lasted an evening, and it would just be swept up the next morning and the carpets rolled back down again. And that idea stuck with me. As soon as he told me about that practice, that stuck with me all the way through. So I knew I had to design a ball dress and a floor, if you like. I wanted to reproduce a Regency chalked floor, and we will come on to in a moment a sketch of that, but I can't show images of it yet because it hasn't been made, but it will be at Firle Place. There is a scenic artist who's coming in to reproduce the design I've done on the floor at Firle. They're actually letting me put chalk all over their ancient floors, which is very amazing of them. So this dress that was going to go with it had to have a train, So I was looking specifically at dresses with trains, but also I started looking at these orders of sort of knighthood and military orders, and then found this picture of this cloak, the Grand Cross of the Order of Bath, and it, you know, it's so similar to the idea of a train, and yet this was a mail piece, which I thought was interesting. I knew I wanted to work in red fairly early on, partly because I knew there was going to be a war-related theme to the piece, because Britain was at war so much during that period. I mean, not just the Napoleonic Wars, but that, you know, there was sort of battle after battle after battle going on from the late Georgian throughout the Regency, and so many lives being lost, you know, and the naval importance inspired another piece, because, you know, Britain was setting sail the whole time to do battle. So I wanted to incorporate military themes and shapes. So I looked at these kind of most ornate and beautiful medals and stars that were given out, and tried to reproduce some of them in paper. You can see quite how much excess I produce sometimes from pieces in the top right hand corner. And I wanted the dress to have a train, and I wanted the design on the train to blend into the design of the floor, so that the piece was one whole, really. That's a close-up of the train of the dress. So although thinking about a ball, you think about glamorousness and beauty and money, I wanted to kind of show the dark undercurrent of all of this. I mean, war is a dark, destructive process, and so there are sort of, and again, it was reflecting themes of the Regency. We hear all about the wealthy in that time, and again, the adaptations we watch on telly tend to be about the wealthy. But there was so much poverty and sort of as this country was moving into, you know, from home working towards the Industrial Revolution, there was all sorts of people that were being lost in the process and sort of falling to the side. So on the train of the dress, I embroidered some teeth, because I'd heard this gory story about how soldiers had fallen on the Battle of Waterloo. They would, people would go around and pull their teeth out and take them home and make dentures from them for the wealthy at home. So I just wanted some gory details in this beautiful garment, you know, so that they're hidden and they're surprising in that sense. The slide just before that showed that's the fountain that's produced down the front of the dress out of quilling. That's the Victoria. It's called the Victoria Fountain in the Steine area of Brighton, but it was actually its foundation stones were laid during the Regency, and yeah, I've reproduced it out of quilling. And then again on the back of the train, I made these cannons out of tissue paper, because I wanted them sort of rising out of this, again, this beautiful dress, this kind of weapon of war, rising up out as if out of the ocean. And there are areas of map embroidered on the back of the train, and they will, when the chalk floor is reproduced, they will match the map that's part of the chalk floor as well. So
I just love, Stephanie, too, your process images and seeing how the paper physically goes from flat to textured and dimensional, with the addition of the stitching and the different manipulations you're doing.
yeah,
And
yeah,
you know,
it does pull it about, definitely.
yeah, it's really, really beautiful. And to see the process of the quilling technique as well.
Yeah, and I have to use pins for quilling, and you know, there are so many crossovers. You know, you use pins normally for fabric, but I'm using pins with paper to quilling to put the quills in place. And yeah, there's just so many crossovers between paper and textiles, and there really are. That's one of the buttons out. Actually, those were made by one of the volunteers I was working with at the townhouse, and I just, again, I sort of they've been amazing, because I'm very bad at working with other people in that I'm not used to it. I'm used to just being me in my own room, you know, getting on with stuff. And this time I've had about 9 helpers, and So I said to Jilly that I needed these buttons, and I showed her some images of naval buttons from the time, and could she sort of think about how we might make them out of paper. And she's, you know, did a quilling coil and then sort of pushed the middle up, and then she's covered it over, and then she's painted it, and she's used this kind of gel sort of to make the form, and come back to me with these amazing naval buttons that are sewn down the sides of the dress. And you know, it was quite impressive how they ran with some of the vague notions I was giving them. You know, this has been the one element of everything that I just need to see happen, but in the sense that it was one of the first things I learned about the period, and I just am so excited to see it actually become real. It will just be, it's been in my head for 3.5 years or more, I think now. It's going to be used for weddings and things just right up until then. So it will be the week before, well, the day before, it will be literally doing the last of the chalking before it gets opened. And then it will be all ribboned off so that no one can walk on it until it's destroyed at the end. You know, it's an ephemeral piece. It'll only last the length of the exhibition as they only lasted the length of the dance, the ball. So
Yep.
yeah, it's exciting. So again, I was tying in with themes of war, and you've got Poseidon and sort of war on the ocean on the one side with the curved lines, and then you've got war on the land with the straight lines on the other, and a centaur. And at the top, in the top back corners, I've given a link there to a piece that's on the V&A's website. For copyright reasons, I couldn't show the original piece itself, but those images that are actually upside down in the middle of the design, as you see it, are taken from an embroidered a piece by a lady called Anne West, again from the period, and she must have possibly sat in her window and just watched all the people on the street going by. So you've got all these Regency characters in this beautiful, she was using kind of felt and hand embroidering, obviously, all sorts of different characters, and then biblical scenes on this amazing piece that's held by the V&A. And again, I'm reflecting the good and the bad side of war, in the sense that there are kind of glamorous soldiers up in one corner, and on the other is a sailor who's obviously come back, lost a leg, and is begging on the streets. And the idea of homelessness seems to have been the Vagrancy Act, in fact, that we still use in this country today. In Britain, was enacted first in 1824 because soldiers and sailors were coming back from the Napoleonic Wars and others, and were making the streets look a bit messy. But you know, the rich didn't like the fact that they could see evidence of the bad side of empire as it was being built at that side, at that stage, coming back. And on the streets of Brighton particularly, and London, there were all sorts of veterans who were in bad shape, who were homeless. And I know that since then, you know, we've continued. Sometimes that's been something that's continued, and I wanted to reflect that idea, the glamour of going off to war, but the awful effects afterwards. And in the middle at the back, you've actually got a fan shape as part of the design, and that's from Worthing Museum. That fan actually shows the encampments, the military encampments around Brighton and Sussex from 1794, and it's the only sort of drawn evidence of them, but it was produced on a fan for sort of maybe, you know, the girlfriend or the wife of a soldier to have on an accessory, on a fashion accessory. It seems sort of such an obscure way of producing, you know, an illustration of a military encampment, but yeah, tying into themes of fans that I was looking at the time.
Was there an actual Admiral Sir Robert Smart, excuse me?
There was, yes. And you know, given it's I couldn't find an admiral who's actually linked to the Regency Townhouse or Brighton or any of those kind of themes that I'd been looking at until then. So in the end, I just linked to my own family history. I don't think I am actually related to him, but when I found a Robert Smart, you know, he obviously kind of appealed to me. And I'd seen a particular naval frock coat in the National Maritime Museum in the store there that I wanted to try and reproduce. And so again, those two things came together. And then in the library, the Caird Library of the National Maritime Museum, they had this amazing diary written and drawn, because he'd done all these beautiful illustrations in it, by this sailor who was actually on a ship that was being captained by Sir Robert Smart. And when I found those three elements, they just seemed to come together. So I've reproduced parts of the diary, the text, for example, you can see down the bottom there that I sort of was using tracings and transfer paper to put the text from the diary onto the back of the jacket. And then again, down the side of his breeches, you've got some of the text and some of the, I reproduced some of the drawings of the ships, because this sailor had, he got obviously restrained by the shape of his book, just being 2 pages, and he'd wanted to draw the horizon with ships on it. And so he'd made kind of concertina, long pieces of paper that he'd stuck into his diary, and then he'd been able to draw the whole horizon that he was seeing. And I think you saw early on that I like working in a concertina shaped sketchbook. So again, really appealed. So I've reproduced some of his drawings down the whole length of the leg on this uniform. And then I had to work out how to do this trim out of paper. So there's layers there of blue paper tablecloth and gold tissue paper, and then gold stitching, and I was using different stitching designs and overlaying them to try and get the effect that you can see up the top there of the actual trim on these kind of beautiful military jackets. And the epaulettes were interesting. Again, I used Misahiki, Japanese Misahiki rice paper cord to make the coils in the end, and embroidery, thick embroidery thread that I was kind of twisting to get the tassely bits, and then cardboard and gold paint and whatever else was working, and I was pleased with the result. At one point I thought, there's no way I can do this. I can't get these metal coils to look like metal out of paper. I just can't do it. But between me and the volunteers, them piping up with ideas, then we got there in the end, and yeah, I think they work okay.
In this one, you've specifically referenced a French style. Would he be going to, the same ball as the other Regency characters that we've been introduced to?
Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that. That was where I started from. I wanted two male figures and one female, because I wanted the idea that they might be vying for her attentions at the ball. So we have 1 ball gown and 2 uniforms. And of course, if there was any kind of competition going on, I had to, and because I was reflecting themes of war so much, I had to reflect this idea of the French and the British, across the channel. They were at war with each other the whole of this period. And therefore I had to reflect Napoleon, because he's such an important figure at the time. And we've just talked about sort of the materials to make the epaulettes, and this, sort of trying to get something, turn paper into to look like something else. And I was quite pleased with this piece, because I was using greaseproof paper in the end to get the gold trim down the side. It's this gold embroidery thread sewn over it. But it's greaseproof paper behind, just from, a roll for cooking in the kitchen. I was so stuck for so long, what would give me the right look. And then I love that. I love, seeing, pushing my material, pushing it, see what it will do, what weird elements of paper I can come up with that will give me something that looks completely like something else. So yeah, this piece is based largely around Napoleon. Even the mannequin, I had to change at one point. I was trying to use this more barrel-chested mannequin for the last piece you saw, and it just wasn't working. I didn't have a pattern for a frock coat. I was making it up. I was trying to work out from just a flat image how it might have been made or how I should make it. And it just wasn't hanging right on my mannequin. I bought this shorter barrel-chested mannequin, and then as soon as I made, because Napoleon was slightly shorter, he was slightly rounder, as soon as I swapped the mannequins and got a taller, thinner one for the naval frock coat and a shorter, squatter one for this one, then it worked. Then I could get the shapes I needed for the jackets I was making, and it made sense. And again, I've written on this piece, so you've got the letter of surrender to the Prince Regent down the sleeve, and you've got a letter to Josephine when she announced she was pregnant on the pocket of the jacket, because I thought that one was more private, so it had to be closer to his body and sort of more hidden when the sleeves are down. Yeah, there's all sorts of elements in Napoleon. The bees down the front, the toggles, I quite like the idea of playing with the idea of the duffel coat, which again was probably introduced at about that period. And so the toggles needed, again, to the shape of the toggle. I didn't want to just do a plain toggle, so I went for the bee because that was Napoleon's symbol for empire. So yeah, really interested to know the duffel coat was that old. I thought it was a more modern piece, but to know that it was being introduced at that point, again, it was a military. So much military fashion was influencing non-military fashion during this period. There was such an important trend. Women's and men's fashion was changing because of things that were happening in military fashion. So the duffel coat was one of those things that we've worn since, that comes originally with sort of military undertones.
Can you speak a little bit about the inspiration about this piece and how it differs from the previous pieces in the collection?
There are 3 white, I don't know what to call them, dresses, garments, pieces in the collection. And they are all going to be shown, well, underlit, but partially underlit. And so the lights are going to be coming on and off. The overhead lights are going to be coming on and off in the exhibition, and there'll be lighting, there's going to be lighting under the dresses of each of the 3 white ones. One of my early ideas was to actually project onto a white skirt. And I like the idea of projecting the shadows of grasses onto the hem, so that you had a design around the hem of a piece that was moving. And I thought that's what I was going to do. I've ended up changing it slightly so that the underlighting is going to show all sorts of layers of cutting and stitching that don't show up when they're lit, when these pieces are lit from the outside. So shadows are going to appear on the skirts that don't seem to be there otherwise. And I am going to project onto the walls. These 3 pieces are all inspired by the idea of the walking dress, which in that period included the outer garments, the undergarments, the bonnet, the parasol, anything that a lady would any accoutrements that she would wear and carry whilst she was promenading. And usually you were walking at that time to be seen by others. And I like the idea of promenading along the promenade at Brighton and also across estates like at Firle Place. So these 3 pieces are all inspired by that idea of walking, and also, of course, by white work. I mean, white was such an important colour in the period. So many of these long empire line dresses were white, and then you had white work stitching on that white fabric. So there's a lot of embroidery on the 3 white pieces as well, as other techniques.
And you've got, is this parasol to match the, okay.
Yeah, there's actually 2 parasols that will be shown. One is much smaller and is a parasol fan. It was first come across, is actually from a museum in LA, I believe, the FIDM Museum. And it's a fan that turns into a parasol. I thought it was such a unique design. It's actually more Victorian rather than Regency, but I just had to reproduce it because it was so beautiful. So the other piece is like that. This one was inspired because I was looking at letters. There's a collection of letters from the period held at the Regency townhouse, and in many of them, they're going backwards and forwards between family members. And in many of them, there's mention of the health of different members of the family, and also therefore of remedies, medicines that they were using at the time. One of them was willow bark. It seems to come up a lot as a sort of, because it's a derivative of aspirin. it's what we now think of as where we get aspirin from. So I wanted the idea of willow and in there. This was even before the pandemic, and I've gone on and produced another piece as well as part of the collection that links to medicine. But I wanted this parasol to very much have the feel that when you were underneath it, you were under a weeping willow. And so if it's going to be lit from above in the exhibition, so again, playing with shadows, you're going to get the shadows of the shapes of the leaves that are on above each of the spokes, and then the tassels are obviously to reflect the leaves hanging down if you were standing beneath the tree. I think on the next one you can see some of the spokes as I was making it, and those are paper, well, cardboard lolly sticks. And well, I suppose they're paper, aren't they? They're paper, rolled paper, so they become like cardboard, but they are lolly sticks. I managed to find some extra long ones, which I didn't think I'd be able to do at first, and then I drilled them and tied them again with this Japanese Misahiki card. And even the beads are made out of paper, so cut sort of long, thin V shapes of paper, and then roll them up and then varnish them, and you get paper beads. Yeah, and it shows, just using a hole punch in my work just shows how I saw paper. And that's 4 of the dresses at Firle. That's in the long gallery where the black dresses will be shown.
So in with this piece, how is the parasol shown? Is it in a separate room or?
Yeah, the 2 parasols will be in a bedroom.
Okay.
The white dresses will be in the dressing room that belongs to that bedroom, if you see what I mean. 5 white dresses will be standing down the length of the long gallery, and the long gallery is really long, so I've got this lovely stretch of space to have them in with their hangings behind each one. And then, as I said, the Victorian dresses, the next room you get to is in the Victorian ante room, and yeah, they're scattered throughout the house. I've been allowed to put them in any room throughout the house, which is amazing. It's just really exciting.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for talking about this collection. And I think we're all very excited and wishing, I know myself from America, I would love to be able to visit Firle House if I could. So hopefully, we'll get to see some lovely pictures after the exhibition, and for
Yeah.
our members who are in the UK, hopefully they'll be able to make it.
Well, you're having to book. You're having to book in order to come because of COVID. But it seems like we'll be okay to go ahead and have people just sort of staggered coming through one at a time through the booking system. And I'm hoping that we might even be able to create a virtual reality version of the exhibition. So there might be a way that you can view it online in the long run. We're looking into that as well. So if you keep an eye on firle.com, their website, then you might find the exhibition becomes virtual, which would be really exciting.
I hope that the virtual tour is a possibility for those of us who can't travel.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone might be wondering what's in the background. You asked about storage for the pieces, so I thought I'd have them in storage behind me. So that is the Weeping Willow parasol, and they're all covered in Tyvek. So that's become like a balloon shape with this Tyvek covering over it. And then I've got big cardboard tubes with the hangings in and things. Everything in my room is covered in Tyvek, and I've got more hanging all over the place. So just in case anyone wonders what those white shapes are behind me.
Yes, because that was a question that I had sent before that I didn't know if we'd get time to. So I'm glad that you brought it up. It really is curious to me in seeing the images of the exhibition, what the life of the pieces is after the exhibition comes down, and if you end up living with them, or if, like you said, if they go into storage, and how you store them.
Well, I've been looking at what the museums do by going into their storage areas. I've been talking to people in textile preservation to try and understand the temperatures and things that they would normally, or the humidity levels that they would normally be working with. But I've been quite scared actually about, keeping these pieces all in pristine condition for this last year during COVID, keeping them okay for the exhibition. Again, I've been very lucky that one of my volunteers offered up her spare room. So a lot of them are just in one place, and she's looking after them and looking at them as we go along. And then I have a number here, and I have some in a storage unit. After this exhibition at Firle, some of them will go and be exhibited at Chertsey Museum and then at Worthing Museum. So there's a life even to the exhibition, and obviously online. But some of them have been specifically designed using paper that isn't color fast, because I actually want them to change and age slightly. So working as a conceptual fine artist, I actually want the pieces to age, really. I was going into storage units in museums and seeing real garments from the time that have faded. So if you look under the armpit or in the hem, you can see what the original color is, but on the outside, the surfaces have changed. And because I was looking at themes of empire and sort of empires rising and falling and things aging, and history and memory and how we forget things, and how we all age, our bodies age. I wanted that theme in there. So although all the pieces will actually be for sale too, I'm going to have to warn anyone that buys anything that this piece will age, will change, or any collection it went on to, anywhere else that it went, it's got a life that's, you know, it's going to change. It's going to change over time, and I don't even know exactly how. I know, you know, I've done some experiments, but I haven't had long enough periods to know exactly how the colors will change. It's going to be interesting to see. I saw some pieces where the underside was big sort of looping tacking stitches, if you like. And I know that in the Regency, we talk about fast fashion today, but I know that during the Regency, you know, parties were happening every night and dressmakers were having to keep up. So things were having to be produced very fast. And so some of the understitch, you know, the undersides have been left looking really rough. Whereas the outer sides are beautiful, tiny, you know, hand stitching. So I reflected that on the front of one of the black dresses. I've used big stitches that you can see because I wanted to bring that to the front too. But it's wonderful, isn't it, when you look at historical pieces and you just see that personality in there, the person who made it. There's sort of the bit they thought they could get away with, or, you know, some element like that is really nice to see. It's like sketching, isn't it? Sketching under the final piece of artwork. It's a similar idea in fabric.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. I'd like to thank Stephanie for taking this time to talk to us about her work and collection that will be on display at Firle House starting the 29th of August through the end of October. Please check out more about her research and creative process on her website and blog. You can easily get swept away into a wonderland of paper and stitch reading it all. To check out more about the Textile Society of America, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or visit our website. Thank you.